The gorilla cub was so weak he couldn't hold himself upright for more than a few seconds at a time. When the wildlife rescue team finally carried him through the doors of the family's care center that cold November evening, his arms hung slack at his sides, his breathing was thin and labored, and his eyes dark, glassy, and impossibly still stared at nothing. He weighed just over 4 pounds. The veterinarian who had driven 2 hours to assess him kept her voice calm and measured, but the look she exchanged with the family told a different story. Nobody in that room was talking about miracles. They were only quietly wondering whether this little creature would still be breathing by morning. His name was Kibo. He had been found deep inside a forest reserve, clinging to his mother's body. By the time rescuers reached him, he had been alone for 3 days. The trauma was severe. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and emotionally collapsed in a way that the family had rarely seen in any animal they had cared for. He refused the first bottle of formula. He turned his face away from the second. He flinched at gentle hands and showed no interest in warmth or comfort. He simply lay in his blanket-lined basket, eyes half open as though the effort of being alive had already grown too great. Would he make it through the night? The family had fostered injured and orphaned animals before. They understood that survival in these first hours was never guaranteed. But there was something different about Kibo's silence. It wasn't just physical weakness. It was as if some part of him had already decided that the world was no longer worth engaging with. And that more than the dehydration, more than the weight loss, was what frightened them most. That same night, while the family sat quietly nearby watching over the cub, the house's other resident made his entrance. Max was a 7-year-old golden Labrador, steady, unhurried, and possessing that particular brand of calm that only truly gentle dogs carry naturally. He had seen new animals come through the home before. He knew better than to rush toward them or push his luck. But when he rounded the corner of the room and caught sight of the small basket and its trembling occupant, he did something that stopped the entire family cold. He didn't bark. He didn't sniff aggressively or circle with excitement. He walked slowly across the room, lowered his body to the floor a respectful distance away from the basket, and simply lay down beside it. Why did the cub ignore every human that night, but not the dog? Nobody could explain it in that first hour. But something in Max's stillness seemed to register where nothing else had. The cub, who had flinched at every gentle human touch, didn't flinch at Max. He didn't curl tighter into himself. He went almost imperceptibly, a little more still. Not the stillness of fear, something closer to the stillness of recognition, as if some ancient wordless part of him understood that this creature nearby meant no harm. The family kept a careful eye on both of them through the night. By early morning, the cub had still taken very little formula, and his condition remained fragile. But there was one change the family noticed when they reviewed their observations. Every time Max shifted position or moved out of eye line, Kibo stirred slightly. Every time Max settled back close to the basket, the cub's restless movement slowed again. It was subtle. It was not miraculous. But in a situation where any positive sign was everything, it was enough to matter. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with medicine. It begins with feeling safe enough to stay. By the second full day, the cub was still critically weak, but something had shifted in his behavior. He had begun looking for Max, not with dramatic gestures or sounds, but with his eyes. When the Labrador left the room, Kibo's gaze tracked toward the door. When Max returned and settled nearby, the small body in the basket would ease again. The family began to understand that this was not a coincidence, and it was not a phase. The dog had become Kibo's first emotional anchor in the world, the one presence that the cub's shattered nervous system had decided, for reasons no one could fully explain, was safe. Then, on the third night, something happened that made the family cry quietly in the kitchen afterward. The cub, who had still resisted being held, who still turned his face from offered hands, reached out in his sleep and rested one tiny hand on Max's paw. He didn't wake. He didn't pull away. He simply rested there, fingers loosely curled against the dog's warm fur, and for the first time since arriving, he didn't look like an animal bracing to disappear. He looked, in that small fragile moment, like something that might actually choose to stay. The Labrador wasn't just being friendly. He was changing the cub's will to live. The veterinarian returned the following morning with cautious optimism. Kibo had taken more formula during the night. His vitals were still concerning, but the downward slide had stopped. She was pleased, but she also sat the family down with a warning they hadn't fully considered yet. Even if Kibo survived the physical crisis, she explained, emotional trauma in young primates could quietly derail everything that followed. A cub who never fully trusted again would struggle to eat properly, to bond with caregivers, to develop the confidence he would eventually need. The early emotional environment, she said, mattered just as much as the medical care. The family looked over at Max, lying peacefully beside the cub's basket, tail occasionally sweeping the floor, eyes half closed and content. And for the first time they allowed themselves to wonder, what happens when the one creature Kibo trusts most can no longer be the one who stays? The weeks that followed were not a straight line toward recovery. There were bad days, mornings when Kibo refused to eat, afternoons when he retreated deep into his blanket and wouldn't engage with anyone. Progress in rescued animals rarely looks like a clean upward arc. It looks more like weather, unpredictable, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally breathtaking in its sudden shifts. But through all of it, one thing remained consistent. Kibo's relationship with Max continued to deepen in ways the family hadn't expected and couldn't have planned for. The cub began copying the dog. Not consciously, not dramatically, but in the quiet, absorbing way that young primates learn from anything they trust. When Max stretched out in a patch of afternoon sun by the back window, Kibo would crawl beside him and lie in the same direction. When Max moved toward his water bowl, the cub would follow and peer in curiously. When Max trotted toward the back door, Kibo would hurry clumsily after him, arms swinging, determined not to be left behind. The cub wasn't just attached to Max. He was learning how to live through him. The family's home slowly transformed around the pair of them. Max became unusually attentive, hovering close during Kibo's nap times, lifting his head immediately at any small sound from the cub's corner of the room. He was not anxious about it. He was simply present in the way that certain dogs become present around beings they have quietly decided to watch over. The cub, in turn, grew bolder by degrees. He began reaching for toys left nearby. He started exploring the low furniture, pulling himself up and investigating surfaces with increasing confidence. He stole Max's blanket on at least 3 separate occasions, dragged it to his own corner, and refused all negotiations. The family laughed for the first time in weeks. The frail cub from the first night was starting slowly to feel like himself. There were still fear moments. Animals who have experienced early trauma don't simply leave it behind. It lives in them, surfaces unexpectedly, and has to be met again and again. About 6 weeks into Kibo's recovery, a severe thunderstorm rolled through the area one evening. The lights flickered, thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows. And Kibo, who had been sitting comfortably on the floor near Max, suddenly panicked in a way the family had not seen before. He scrambled backward, knocked over a basket, pressed himself into the corner of the room, and began shaking hard, a full-body tremor that nothing the family tried could reach. They spoke softly. They moved slowly. They offered familiar objects and familiar voices. Nothing helped. Then Max got up from his spot across the room, walked directly to the corner, and lay down against the cub's side. The shaking didn't stop immediately, but it slowed, and within a few minutes, Kibo had pressed his whole small body into the Labrador's warmth and gone from rigid to limp, not from exhaustion but from something releasing. He whimpered once, softly, and then went quiet. Max didn't move from that spot for the rest of the night. When the world still felt like it could collapse without warning, one loyal dog became the definition of home. But recovery, real, visible recovery, also brought the problem the family had been carefully not discussing out loud. The stronger Kibo grew, the more undeniable it became that a family home was not where a gorilla could remain. He was still a baby now. He was manageable, curious, gentle. But gorillas grow. They grow large and strong and complex, and they have specific needs that no family living room, however loving, could ever properly meet. He would need expert care from primate specialists. He would need space, real, proper, appropriate space. He would need exposure to other gorillas, to begin learning what he actually was and how to live among his own kind. He would need, eventually, a life that the family could not give him. It had been part of the arrangement from before Kibo ever arrived. But knowing something and accepting it, especially once a creature has woven itself into the daily texture of your life, are two entirely different things. How do you prepare to separate two souls who help save each other? Plans began to take shape for Kibo's transfer to a specialized gorilla rehabilitation center several hours away, a facility with trained primatologists, proper habitat, and the long-term resources needed to prepare him for his future. The center was reputable. The timing, the veterinarian confirmed, was right. Kibo was healthy enough now. Waiting longer would only make the transition harder. The family agreed. They knew it was right. They signed the paperwork, packed what Kibo would need, and told themselves they were ready. What they were not prepared for was the morning the transport crate arrived. Kibo was placed inside gently, carefully, with the slow and practiced hands of experienced handlers. And for the first time since those terrifying first nights when he had been too weak to make a sound at all, the cub let out a cry, raw and low and searching, that made every person in the room stop moving completely. He wasn't looking at the family. He was looking at Max. The transfer team handled the moment with practiced calm, but even they went quiet. Max had come to the edge of the room at the sound of the cub's cry, not barking, not frantic, just there. His tail was low, His eyes were steady on the crate. He paced once toward it, and then stopped, as if he understood that pressing closer would only make this harder for both of them. Kibo reached one hand through the crate's wire mesh. Max walked over and stood close, close enough for the cub to feel the warmth of him, close enough that for a brief still moment contact was made. Then the handlers gently moved the crate toward the vehicle, and the connection broke. Real love doesn't keep a wild animal where it feels comfortable. Real love prepares it for the life it actually needs. The goodbye, in the end, was not long enough to feel finished, which is probably how most necessary goodbyes feel. The family stood in the driveway until the vehicle was out of sight. Max sat beside them. Nobody spoke for a while. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since Kibo arrived. Not peaceful quiet, absent quiet. The specific, strange silence of a space from which something living and irreplaceable has been removed. Max spent the first 2 days checking Kibo's corner, the cub's basket, the patch of floor where they used to sleep side by side in the sun. He was not distraught in any dramatic sense. He was simply looking in the patient and persistent way dogs look when they are waiting for something to come back. After a few days he stopped looking. He settled back into his routine, but the family noticed he was quieter than before. Did the separation undo the progress that had taken so long to build? The rehabilitation center sent updates. At first the news was cautious. Kibo was eating, but minimally. He was interacting with his caretakers, but carefully, with none of the bold curiosity he had shown in the family home. He was adjusting, the primatologist said, but adjustment, especially for a young gorilla who had known trauma, was not the same as thriving. It would take time, it would take consistency. It would take the patient, skilled work of people who had spent their careers learning how to help animals like Kibo find their footing in a new world. The family received each update and tried to take it as good news, even when it felt incomplete. They reminded themselves that they had done the right thing, that love had required this, that letting go was not abandonment, it was the next step in a long, ongoing act of care. Months passed, then more months, and slowly the news from the center began to change. Kibo was gaining strength. He was engaging more fully with enrichment activities, the ropes and structures and objects the center used to build cognitive and physical confidence. He was spending time near other young gorillas in supervised settings. He was, the specialist reported with carefully measured optimism, developing into a healthy young animal. But after 2 years, would any part of him remember where that strength first came from? 2 years after that November evening when a barely breathing cub had arrived in a blanket basket, the rehabilitation center called the family with an invitation. Kibo had progressed well enough that a carefully supervised visit had been approved. The center wanted to observe his responses to familiar people from his early life. It was, they explained, part of understanding his emotional history and how it had shaped his development. The family began preparing for the visit immediately. They talked through what to expect. They reminded themselves not to project, not to hope for recognition that might not come. Gorillas were intelligent, emotionally complex animals, but 2 years was a long time, and Kibo had experienced a great deal of change since those early weeks. Nobody said what they were all actually thinking. They were thinking about Max. The Labrador was 9 years old now, a little slower in the mornings, a little more silver around the muzzle, but still himself, still gentle, still steady, still carrying that quiet certainty that had drawn a traumatized cub to him across a room on the worst night of that small life. On the morning of the visit, Max climbed into the back seat of the car with the same untroubled ease he had always carried. He didn't know where they were going. He simply came because they asked him to. When they arrived at the rehabilitation center and stepped out into the afternoon light, the first thing they heard, before they had even walked toward the enclosure, was a sound from somewhere deeper inside the facility. A low, searching vocalization that the family had not heard in 2 years. One of the center's staff members looked up, surprised. "He doesn't usually do that," she said quietly. "Not for visitors." The enclosure was large and carefully designed. Climbing structures, ropes, shaded areas, open ground. The young gorilla who stood on the far side of it bore almost no physical resemblance to the 4-pound creature who had arrived in a blanket basket 2 years before. He was bigger, broader, and moved with a confidence that had been entirely absent from those early weeks. He looked in every outward sense exactly like what he had become, a young gorilla thriving in an environment built for his needs. He was already watching the gate when the family walked through. He saw them, and his body language shifted into something alert and curious, but not quite settled. He looked at the family members, one by one, with the careful attention of an intelligent animal sorting through information. Recognition flickered. He moved a few steps closer. Then he stopped, and then Max stepped forward. In one instant, everyone understood that this was not casual curiosity. The young gorilla went completely still. Not the stillness of fear or uncertainty. the stillness of something slotting into place. He stared at the Labrador, deeply, with an intensity that made the center's staff exchange glances across the enclosure. And then, after a moment that felt much longer than it was, he began to move, not slowly this time, purposefully, directly. He crossed the space between them with a focus that left no room for doubt about where he was going or why. He reached the barrier and pressed as close as the design allowed, and then he did something that stopped every person watching him cold. He made the same gestures he had made as a cub, the same slight head tilt, the same reaching movement with one hand, the same searching, open expression that the family had seen on the worst nights, when the tiny creature in the blanket basket had been trying, in the only language available to him, to say that something nearby felt safe. 2 years of growth and change and distance, and the body had not forgotten what the mind might have been expected to release. The safest place from the hardest time of his life, and he still remembered exactly where it was. Max stepped as close as he could, and stood there, tail moving slowly, body low and relaxed, giving back the same calm energy he had offered on the very first night. He didn't perform, he didn't push, he was simply, completely present, the same dog he had always been. The caregivers were stunned, not because the gorilla remembered people from his past. That was possible, even expected in an animal of his intelligence. What stunned them was the specificity of it. The young gorilla had scanned the family and found the dog first. He had crossed the enclosure not toward the humans who had fed him and held him and cried over him in the kitchen, but toward the creature that had lain quietly beside a blanket basket in November and said, in the only way available to him, "You are safe here." The family cried, quietly at first, then not so quietly. There was something about watching this, something about seeing that the smallest, most essential comfort from the most frightened moment of a young life had been carried forward across 2 years, and all that change and distance, that was simply too much to absorb without feeling it fully. Out of every face from his hardest days, the one he searched for first was his oldest friend. The visit was kept brief and carefully managed. The center's staff documented everything, noting the behavioral responses with the measured language of professionals who are trained to observe without projecting. But even they, in the quieter moments of the afternoon, seemed to be doing something that looked very much like being moved. One primatologist, speaking to the family afterward, said that early emotional anchors in rescued primates were more durable than most people understood. The memory of safety, she explained, especially safety formed during a period of acute trauma, had a way of embedding itself at a level that ran deeper than ordinary memory. It wasn't just that Kibo remembered Max. It was that Max had been present at the exact moment that something in the cub had decided that trust was still possible. And that moment, she said, didn't simply pass. It stayed. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. Max slept across the back seat. The family watched the road and let the afternoon settle around them. There was grief in it, the particular kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from understanding how much something meant. There was also something that was harder to name, but felt something like gratitude for the fact that love, when it is real and patient and given without conditions, has a way of outlasting the circumstances that created it. Kibo was where he needed to be. He was strong and safe and growing into the life that had been impossible to imagine for him on that cold November night. Max was older now, slower in the mornings, more silver at the muzzle, but he was still gentle, still steady, still the dog who had once walked across a room, lowered himself to the floor beside a frightened and failing creature, and offered the only thing he had, his presence, his warmth, his quietly unshakable certainty that whoever was beside him was worth staying close to. The truest proof of love is being remembered long after you had to say goodbye. He came into their home too weak to trust the world. He left it stronger, braver, and ready for a life none of them could have imagined for him in those first terrifying hours. And 2 years later, in an enclosure full of everything a young gorilla needs to become what he was always meant to be. The first thing he looked for when the gate opened was not a face. It was a dog, a patient, silver-muzzled Labrador who had never asked for anything in return, and who, without knowing it, had shown a frightened cub the most important thing a creature can learn in its hardest hour. That kindness, once truly felt, is never really forgotten.